fellow here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, which is where you are right now. Also part of something called the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. I'm a political scientist and a friend of Alexandra's. I think our connection goes back to the state of Indiana.
That's right.
Where I've been frequently because of certain family connections. But she is the author of a new book, The Soul of Civility, which just happens to be here in front of me. It was published fairly recently, and she's been speaking about the book. It's very timely given the high, whoops, I forgot to, it's very timely given the lack of civility in our general civic and political discourse in the United States. And she addresses that issue directly. She's got an organization, Civic Renaissance, a newsletter, and a following. She served in Washington, which is actually, she might tell you, one of the reasons she ended up writing this book, that experience. And so with that, Lexi, why don't you tell us about the book, what it's about, and what some of your, approaches and solutions are.
Thank you so much for having me today, Dr. Fukuyama. Real honor to be here. We met, you're right, in 2019 on my birthday. So I think it was the best birthday gift I got that year, the fact that I got to shake your hand and meet you. And so thrilled to be here. Thanks to the Center for having me and to Stanford for hosting. My book explores the most essential question of our day, which is how do we flourish even across deep difference, even when we deeply disagree. My book came out October 10th, 2023. That's 7 days after Hamas invaded Israel. And that was an appropriate, tragic, but almost an appropriate week to launch the book, because that's this conversation we're having right now and observing the horrors that are happening in the Middle East is a prime example, illustrative example of this essential question of how do we flourish even when we deeply disagree. And it's interesting that there was no appetite for civility all fall, because why be so? Well, no one wanted to talk about civility when kids were being slaughtered, and when it felt existential and it felt like a crisis of identity and livelihood. But I argue throughout the book that it's actually when the stakes feel really existential, feel high, that's when we need civility, which is the art of human flourishing and the bare minimum of respect that we are owed and owe to others by virtue of our common dignity as human beings. That's when we actually need civility most, exactly when it feels existential in times of war or in times of high stakes elections, like what we're going through right now. 2024 is a really unique year for our country, but also for democracy everywhere. This is a year when half the globe is going to the polls. So at the same time, there's this high watermark of democracy for democracy and for our democratic institutions. There actually feel like there are unprecedented threats to our democratic institutions with growing political violence and hyper-partisanship and political divisions that threaten to undermine these institutions of a free and flourishing society. And my book really isn't about institutions. It's about the duties and the habits of citizenship that we lead and have a responsibility to uphold in our everyday. In my theory of civility, that the citizen is and of democracy, the citizen is prior to the state, and that we have a role to play in sustaining our democratic institutions. So I came to my interest in this topic of social norms. Honestly, my mother is called Judy the Manners Lady. So she's an internationally renowned expert on manners and etiquette. And I remember always questioning these norms and proprieties that she asked me to uphold. Why do we do things the way we do them? I hunger for a moral and philosophical rationale and underpinning for our social norms and customs. And yet I generally followed them, and they worked well for me. My mother promised they would lead to success in work and school and life, and she was right. Until I found myself in federal government. I served in federal government 2017 to 2018, and it was an environment of utter anti-human flourishing. All these basic decencies and common niceties that I had just kind of been, raised with and lived by my entire life, all of a sudden they ceased to matter or work. It seemed to be this environment of pure, survivalism and egoism that I was utterly unprepared for. And I saw these two extremes when I was in government. On one hand, there were people who were hostile, they were aggressive, they were belligerent, they were willing to step on anyone to get ahead. And I knew to avoid those people. But on the other hand, there were people who, at first I thought they were my people. They were polished and poised and polite, but these were people who would smile and flatter me and others one moment and then stab us in the back the next. And this second contingent deeply perplexed me. All of a sudden, what I saw was not what I got. I felt like I couldn't trust anyone or anything. My mother had said to me that manners were important because they were an outward expression of our inward character. And yet here I was surrounded by people who were polished enough, had good enough manners, but revealed a really kind of nasty inner character. And this clarified for me what became a core argument of my book, that manners weren't everything, that politeness wasn't everything, and that there is actually an important distinction between politeness and civility. I argue that politeness is etiquette, it's external, it's manners, it's technique, whereas civility is internal. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as our moral equals worthy of a bare minimum of respect just by virtue of our shared moral status as members of the human community. And that crucially, sometimes actually loving someone requires breaking the rules of politeness for a greater good, which is having an honest and candid conversation. Respecting someone enough to disagree with them, tell them, not patronizing them by sweeping a difference under the rug or pretending a disagreement doesn't exist, but actually having that honest and candid conversation. And I argue throughout the book that this is actually a duty of citizenship in a democracy, where debate and telling truths, like bringing our deeply held beliefs to the fore, that's a duty of citizenship in a democracy, and debate the lifeblood of a democracy. So these are themes I explore in my book. I argue that for many reasons, civility is an instrumental good. It supports our democracy. It supports a robust, civil, tolerant discourse. Even in a digital age, it promotes equality. And many other kind of instrumental goods that support a free and flourishing society. But at the end of the day, civility is also good just for its own sake. It's an inherent good, because treating someone with decency and dignity, by virtue of our shared moral status as fellow human beings, that is good, full stop. It's good for others, good for society, but also it's good for ourselves. So civility is this, forgotten, underrated virtue that everyone thinks they know about, but I argue actually no one knows really what true civility is. No one fully appreciates it. And this is my attempt to bring, clarity to this conversation. This book isn't, it's way too long already at 400 pages, but it certainly doesn't have all the answers. But I do hope that it helps clarify for us the questions and sharpens this conversation about what we want more of in a society, especially in a deeply divided and polarized and alienated moment that we find ourselves in, and what we want less of. And I argue what we want less of is kind of the faux niceness and trivial, superficial interactions that I think we're too often contented with, and that we should aim instead for true civility, which is truly loving, truly respecting our fellow citizens and fellow persons. So thank you so much to each of you for being here today and joining this conversation. Thank you again for hosting this, Dr. Fukuyama, and looking forward to the dialogue.
Okay, so we'll open this up in a second. One characteristic of this book is that Lexi really makes a lot of references cross-culturally to a lot of different time periods, authors, civilizations, and it's actually quite fascinating, some of the individual quotes that she comes up with from people I had never heard of. But maybe you want to talk about how you think that this virtue of civility is actually quite cross-cultural and not rooted in any one particular civilization.
Yeah, so I wrote the book on civility that I wanted to write, the kind of book that I like to read, which is interdisciplinary, it's cross-cultural. And it's funny, that's not really the book that the market wanted. I get criticized by academics, like it doesn't fit a certain genre, but human beings don't fit a certain discipline, right? We're a multidisciplinary. And so I wanted this to represent, not just the modern Western American condition. I wanted it to represent the human condition. And so I was raised, in the West. I was raised in America and Canada, and we're all for better or for worse, captive to the educations we were given. But I wanted to remedy these knowledge gaps that I had, and I was intentional about seeking out sources from across time and across place to make sure this did do justice. And it was an inductive exercise. I read etiquette manuals, ethical manuals, religious, treatises from across history and across culture, from ancient Sanskrit texts to ancient Egyptian texts, and to texts from the Middle Ages and the early modern period, to explore this question. And what I found was that there is this remarkable continuity, this kind of core of human wisdom that where thoughtful individuals have across time and place independently observed human nature and the human condition and how people interact, and came to remarkably similar conclusions about what works for this thing called life together with others, and what detracts from it. And in their treatises and their manuals, they've recommended to people that they do more of what works and what contributes to the project of social flourishing, and less of what doesn't. And what's fascinating about this is that these people, these thinkers across time and place, they wouldn't have had to write down these maxims if everyone of their day had been following them, right? I think this trend of human forgetfulness is a core key, that we need to be reminded of this core body of human wisdom time and time again. And I try to illuminate the kind of greatest hits of this genre of the etiquette civility manuals, the how-to manuals from across history and culture, and distill them into and deploy them to help us think more clearly about this question in our own moment, by putting our problems and our divisions into context of those that have come before us. This is not a new question. This is not a new problem. This question of how do we do life together with others is one we've been grappling with for a long time, as long as we've been around as a species, in fact. And there's a lot that we can learn from those who have come before us.
You want to give some examples? I mean,
yes.
you had
So
mentioned...
one of my favorites is Erasmus of Rotterdam. So he's this intellectual superstar of the European Renaissance, and he's an unsung hero of moderation and temperance and prudence. So he was Catholic, and he never left the Catholic Church, but he was critical of the Catholic Church. And I should also say really quickly, he was the most coveted dinner party guest in all of Europe in the 1500s. And he was kind of a peripatetic scholar, thinker, writer, and he never lived for more than 2 years in any one place in his life. And he just traveled from country to country, court to court, kingdom to kingdom, as a tutor to princes and princesses, and he was just jovial and witty and fun, and everyone adored him. And so he was, as I mentioned, he was a Catholic. He was critical of the Catholic Church, corruption, illegitimate children, indulgences, all these different things that he expressed concern over. And he actually inspired a young monk named Martin Luther to with his criticisms, and they ended up having they were friends for a little bit, ended up having a falling out. But he's an unsung hero of moderation because he never left the Catholic Church, but because he was critical of the Catholic Church, no one, the Catholics don't claim him. Because he didn't start his own Protestant sect, the Protestants don't claim him. So he's kind of forgotten to history today, because he was in this period of religious sectarianism, didn't fit any one mold, and we've kind of forgotten about him. But he was brilliant, an absolute genius, and he translated a version of the Greek New Testament, which was really important for a really important scholarly feat. But he also, despite his elevated scholarly pursuits, he cared about manners and civility and common decency. And the story goes that one day he was walking down the street and a youth insufficiently paid him the courtesy he thought he was due. And so he said, that's it. Society's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to write this treatise on manners and civility to set the record straight about what we should expect from our youth today, and talk about the timelessness of this complaint about the manners of kids these days. This goes back to tale as old as time. And so in his handbook for civility in children, it's the only etiquette book that I'm familiar with that categorizes conduct by body part. He has a chapter on the hands, a chapter on the mouth, a chapter on the nose and the eyes, which is very funny. For example, Erasmus is categorically opposed to winking. He says, just never wink, don't do it. That's the stuff for mythical creatures and a tuna fish. He said, just don't do it. Not a fan of winking. Yeah, fair, I know, right? But he also, Erasmus was really important to a gentleman named Norbert Elias, who wrote these two books called Power and Civility, and it was his theory of civilization. And for Elias, he argued that Erasmus marked this sort of tipping point in European history that fostered a renewed sense of bodily control in a new way. Elias argues that before Erasmus, people would, defecate in the corner and belch in public with zero social shame. And then after Erasmus wrote this book, which was an international bestseller, like overnight, and it basically never went out of print for several hundred years, was like immediately translated into every European language. That it fostered this widespread cultural change and mindfulness of social shame and just an interest in social control. And Elias argues that this newfound appreciation for self-restraint and social control and social shame is what allowed for the rise of the nation state. All of a sudden, violence went down. And this is also a story that Pinker tells and picks up on in his Better Angels of Our Nature, that it was because of interpersonal harmony. There was no longer, people just stabbing each other at the dinner table. This is the story that Erasmus or Elias tells, that because of interpersonal increased peace and harmony, that allowed for a centralized state that could provide for people in new ways. And so all that to say, Erasmus, wrote this book 500 years ago. If you pick it up today, it's still remarkably prescient and timeless. He has this beautiful, he had an early conception of germ theory, for example, as well. He says, wash your hands before you eat, which is amazing. This is before we knew about germs. But he says, as you wash your hands, so too cleanse your mind of the pollutants of your day, which I love. Like, before you sit down to eat with someone, just take a break, like purify your mind. Don't bring the baggage of your day into sitting down with someone that you care about, to care enough to share a meal with, which I love. I just think it's a really beautiful, beautiful metaphor. And I love the way Erasmus ends his book, which I think kind of embodies the wellspring of true civility. Erasmus says, readily ignore the faults of others and avoid falling short yourself. And what I love about that, there's just such the inverse of what seems to be the ethos of our day, which all the forces around us tell us to blame and point fingers. The other party, the other side, this person, that person, they're a crook, they're inconsiderate, they're a jerk. And Erasmus says, no. Like, readily ignore the faults and shortcomings of others and avoid falling short yourself. He just totally inverts that, and what I think is so powerful and such a good antidote to our culture that wants to externalize our locus of control and blame. So anyway, part of my project of my life's work is to revive unsung heroes from history, and Erasmus is one of them, one of the many heroes of civility in the book, but just someone who's inherently worth reviving for his own sake.
So one of the people you discuss in the book is Norbert Elias, who talked about progress in history, that people had become more civilized over the centuries. But then you pointed out that he had to flee Europe just before the Second World War and the Holocaust. And Germany at that time was regarded as the most civilized, kind of highest European civilization. And yet it perpetrated, one of the greatest crimes in history. And while we're speaking of so this is, I guess, a question that I've tried to wrestle with, that you can have very civilized manners and relations among a certain group of people who then, towards people that are not in that group, behave like complete barbarians. I don't want to cast aspersions on any particular national or ethnic groups, but this is what they say about both the Japanese and the Germans, that they're either at your throat or at your feet, meaning that among themselves, you go to Japan, there are hardly any policemen because, they don't commit that many crimes, are extremely polite to people, externally. But then they go invade Asia and, Manchuria and Nanjing massacre, because they're not part of the same culture and they're regarded as really not human beings. And then Germany, the same thing. In Germany, you can't cross the street if there's no crosswalk and a signal, because they really love following rules. So they're very rule following among other Germans or people that share that culture. But we know what happened to people that weren't in that group. And so I'm wondering whether part of the problem is not just that you need people to follow rules of civility, but that who you regard as a fellow human being, that understanding needs to be broad enough. Because I think civilization existed among restricted groups of people for many generations, for centuries and millennia. But it's only kind of in recent years that we sort of believe in this liberal view that all human beings qua human beings. Well, it's actually not just liberal. I mean, I actually think it has roots in Christianity, but this idea that that all people really have the equal amount of dignity, and you can't single out certain subsets of human beings as having a lower level.
I think you also tease out a really interesting point that I allude to in the book, but I don't think I explicitly unpack, which is there's kind of these two narratives, these two competing narratives that are very dominant. One is a narrative of decline, of civilizational decline, and we hear a lot of that today from David Brooks to Robert Putnam, who say, society was better and now it's worse. We're ruder, we're meaner, we're not bowling together, we're lonely, and that is a tale as old as time. Hesiod, the ancient Greek historian, he has a story of decline in his account of human nature and creation. There was originally the gold civilization, and then it progressed down to the silver, and now we're at the iron, which is like the worst civilization, where we're not as virtuous as we were in the good old days. The gold. I just think that's fascinating. Like that. But at the same time, there are also these stories of progress, right? People who tell these stories that we're better, we're getting worse, right? Steven Pinker, we're not as violent as we used to be, or people that have this we're in Menlo Park, we're in the heart of Silicon Valley. People who love technology, love progress, and they believe deeply that the world is getting better, and that this unalloyed faith in progress and technology. C.S. Lewis called people who think that the world is getting better, he called that chronological snobbery, this idea that, just because things are improving in some ways, that maybe we're morally improving as well. And I think that the story of Elias, you're right, and Elias fell into this category of someone who told a story of progress, right? That we used to wantonly stab people at dinner time, and now we don't anymore, right? Thanks to Erasmus. That's kind of the simplistic narrative that he tells, and that we're getting better, and yet he's writing that amidst one of the greatest atrocities known to human history, the Holocaust. And I think the antidote that I think history brings to this conversation, and what I certainly argue for in the book, is that human nature actually doesn't change that much. We're just as prone to, we have just as much of a need for human community as we've always had. We're deeply social as a species. We're doggedly social. And we're just as prone to undermine the human social project by succumbing to inordinate self-love, as we always have been. And that these two things are in tension, that there can be ebbs and flows in community, and certainly cultures can have better and worse, epochs and moments. But at its core, I don't think human nature changed. I'm very skeptical of both of these narratives, of kind of unilateral progress and unilateral decline.
Mhm. So we are at a university. If you go out to White Plaza, place is divided between one half of it that has all these empty chairs representing, the hostages that were taken by Hamas, and then there's a tent encampment on the other side. One thing that everybody who runs a university has been trying to figure out is what do you do next year with the incoming class of freshmen in order to train them so that they will be civil towards one another, not polite, but civil, right? And I was just at Cornell about 3 weeks ago, where in fact, they just cleared out their encampment in the last couple of days. And the provost who had invited me was saying, yeah, I mean, just in very concrete terms, what do we teach freshmen next year about how to avoid, the kind of bitterness that we've seen on so many campuses this year? So I guess my question is, what's your response? I mean, how do you think you actually do training of young people to, socialize them into these virtues?
Yes. So in the final chapter of my book, it's called On Misplaced Meaning and Forgiveness. I argue that we largely as a society and as individuals have made idols out of politics and of public life. And I'll tell you a story that illustrates this. On the day we met, 2019, April 15th, that was the day Notre Dame burned. I remember because it was like a tragedy. It was a tragedy. And I remember being absolutely flummoxed at the news coverage of this just objective tragedy. It was, people took just an objective tragedy and said, this is what happens when a socialist is in power, this kind of, mismanagement. And others said, no, this is what happens when you insufficiently, fund when you have insufficient public funding for historic preservation. And people just took what is just an objective tragedy and shoehorned it and approached it through the prism of what their preconceived notions, their political anglings about the world, and fit that. They couldn't just say this is sad and just leave it at that. It had to fit their broader narrative of what they thought was wrong with the world. And I thought that was really emblematic of how we see politics and our political angles and issues everywhere in a way that is actually relatively new. There are other symptoms I see that illuminate this misplaced meaning. One is, again, that politics is everywhere in an unprecedented way, where it feels like every decision we make has a political dimension. Where we grocery shop, where we get our news, where we send our kids to school, who we're boycotting, whatever it is, everything has a political dimension. Very little is just apolitical in nature anymore. Another symptom of this crisis of the idolatry of politics and this crisis of misplaced meaning is the way that people can go from 0 to 60, just instantaneously. It's like their lizard brain is activated, and you treat with insufficient reverence their sacred cow issue, and they're just apoplectic. And it's just like that's a symptom that is emblematic of someone who is responding as if their very identity is under threat. A third symptom of this misplaced meaning is the tragic number of family relationships, lifelong friendships that have ended over political disagreement. Your view on Israel-Palestine, your view on the COVID vaccine, your view on Donald Trump. That's all I need to know about whether I want you in my life. I just, so many people are just like cutting people out left, right, and center over these political differences. And I argue this is a symptom of massively disordered love. So we're elevating to the level of the ultimate, the transient political issues, and letting that take precedent over really beautiful and important things in our lives, such as friendships and family relationships. And in short, we're overdoing democracy. We're oversaturated with the culture wars, and it's everywhere. And as a result, we're undermining democracy. We're not doing democracy very well. It's bad for our souls and bad for society too. And so in my book, I talk about several things that we can do to kind of relegate these important issues to their proper place. If we're only doing the hard things all the time, we're not doing justice to them, we're not doing them well. I talk about things that we can recover that are apolitical in nature, that kind of nourish our souls, that can elevate our minds, and then allow us to come back to these important conversations fresher and better at a later date. But if we're, I talk about friendship, recovering friendship, especially friendship across difference, instead of allowing, one aspect of a person to define the whole, saying, this is actually really fruitful, fertile ground to have dialogue across difference, where we have this baseline of trust and affection to mine these differences. I talk about curiosity, intellectual curiosity being a good in and of itself, but also, not just saying, I know one aspect of you, and I think I know all of, the sum total of who you are because of who you voted for, your view on this issue or that. But saying, you think this, I think differently, like, tell me more. Tell me more about why you think this way. And just having this disposition, like cultivating that curiosity muscle, that again is a recipe for the life well lived, but also an essential tool to healing our deep divisions today. I talk about the sublime. I talk about beauty, staring up at the starry skies at night and contemplating infinity, staring up at the beauty of redwoods that we're surrounded by here in California, just the majesty of nature. There's a whole literature on awe and transcendence, just encountering these moments of majesty and beauty that displace our sense of self. They put who we are and our petty problems into perspective of like the vastness of the universe and the world in a way that's actually really healthy. Edmund Burke, the English and the Irish philosopher and statesman, he talked about, he has an essay called An Inquiry into the Nature of the Beautiful and the Sublime. And he says, something beautiful is something that makes us happy. It brings us pleasure. The sublime is something that terrifies us. It fills us with a sense of awe and smallness, and that's actually a really healthy practice to kind of keeping our egos in check. Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, said that we have a need to daily, minute by minute, conquer what she called the fat, relentless ego that surfaces day in, day out. That's a necessary part of doing this thing called life together with others. And so these are just a few of many possible examples I give of things that can restore our souls and help us recover a sense of balance and harmony. But instead, what we say a lot often today is people who are living in a state of constant fight or flight because these transient political issues have become ultimate issues. And I argue that putting them in a sense of perspective is essential.
Just in a practical way, what would you do with a freshman class? Would you put them in the room together and have them actually confront kind of on a face-to-face basis?
I'm a big fan. You and I both share a love. I'm a big fan of, the person-to-person encounter. You and I both share a love. I think you're still on the board of Braver Angels. This organization that believes that putting people in close proximity across differences helps rehumanize them across these divides. You can't caricature someone as, an evil redneck or whatever it is when you're looking at them face to face, and that there is great power in kind of neutralizing those stereotypes, neutralizing the vitriol by just putting people in close proximity. I think that's a good practical
That
point.
suggests that you should also take away the iPhones of all these freshmen.
Yes, I do think so as well. Exactly.
Okay. Well, why don't we open it up at this point? If anybody else has any comments or questions for Alexandra. Skylar.
What you may say about the concept. Of course, we can all make the choice for ourselves to leave a curiosity with another, even if that person may not be demonstrating civility to us or potentially another group. Mm-hmm. But you then face the consequences of what it means to show that kindness to one person, to the people where they may not be showing that civility. So I think of what the intersection of identity politics here and what it means to be contaminated by your civility to a group. And so I wonder, as we're thinking about making those decisions, what were your findings on how that might affect people's decision-making towards civility?
I'm so sorry. Can you clarify your question? Is your question, what do you do when you're civil and kind and that's not reciprocated? Is that the question, or what is the question?
It's not about whether that civility is reciprocated
Okay.
to you, but how your civility towards one person who may not be accepted by your in-group, how that's perceived by that in-group. So take, for example, the ability to be kind to a white supremacist and try to hear out what their perspective is and lead with civility in that conversation. But then how is that perceived then by a group that is a group of color, for example?
It's a great question. I'm so thrilled that some of my friends and colleagues from the Pro-Human Foundation are here. They're a sponsor of the reception that's happening just after this that you're all invited to at Gable Gardens. Is that right? Yeah. Gamble Gardens, just a 5-10 minute drive away from here. I hope you can all join. But the Pro-Human Foundation was founded around the work and life of an incredible, extraordinary human being and someone I'm honored to call my friend named Daryl Davis. And so he says that, you know, jazz music is his vocation, but race relations and racial reconciliation is his passion. It's his obsession. Have you heard of Daryl Davis before?
I've not.
I'm so thrilled to share with you his story. So he was raised in a diplomatic home, and they traveled the world. He went to international schools, and that kind of gave him, he was kind of inoculated by race. Everyone spoke different languages, had different skin colors, and he was African American. He was, you know, he was Black, but he didn't really, you know, that was not a thing. It wasn't until he was like 9 years old, he moved back to America, and he was harassed. He was bullied on his way home one day, and he had no idea why. And his parents had to sit him down and describe what racism was to him for the first time. It was inconceivable to him. He said, you know, how could someone hate me if they don't even know me just by looking at me? That was like totally perplexing to him. So it was like an early, you know, formative experience that he likes to share. And, you know, he has made it his life's work to seek out and befriend members of hate groups. And through just exposure to him and like him showing curiosity and kindness, like, can I buy you a beer? Can I buy you a meal? He has, what's the word? Converted, you know, people like 300-400 people from these hate groups. Like he's been to KKK ceremonies. He's been like, he has just the most incredible array of stories. And he has encountered a lot of hate, and he gets a lot of hate mail from people like everywhere, from fellow Black people, from white supremacists. And, you know, and he's really unique, right? Talk about not having an in-group, like he doesn't care what his in-group thinks. Like he is who he is, and he cares about this question of helping us more peaceably coexist across deep difference. And he just does what he does, regardless of the consequences. And yes, he gets threats. Yes, he, you know, gets this vicious hate mail, but he's done incredible work, and he's an inspiration to us all, I think. And, you know, when people ask me these questions, like, how can I show decency to someone who believes X or who has done Y? I just share with them Daryl's story. If Daryl can like seek out and sit down and share a meal and spend time with someone who despises him by something over which he has no control, we can too. You know, we can make that effort too with people who believe crazy things or things that we deeply disagree with. Thanks, Skylar. Yes.
So at the university, as Frank was talking about, I mean, we're obviously, like so many campuses, going through a lot. And so there's various efforts on campus that are trying to do this. How do we approach it? How do we teach more of those skills? How do we bring a different mindset? And so one of them that it looks like it's going to be sort of kind of the umbrella initiative that the president, the provost office are supporting, something called E Pluribus, which currently is a program in the law school, and Norm Spalding, who leads it, who's wonderful. Can't say enough nice things about him. And so I was listening, they were doing a study on the efficacy of this program. There are kind of these different components. And there's something that stood out to me from one of the scholars that said, you know, a lot of this it's common sense, if not common practice. And so I'm curious for you, I mean, it's like, we can't be reminded enough, you know, people get those reminders, but it's almost like we need those constant reminders of how do we do this? How do we lean into our humanity? How do we be more civil to one another? So my question is, you know, appreciating that, again, we can't have enough messages, not to undermine that seeing as common sense, but I'm curious if there are things that like stood out to you that might not strike us over the head when you hear of like, oh, of course, that seems resonant to me. Like that's that's common sense, even if I'm not reminded about it enough and it's common practice. So is there anything kind of when you look through the ages or you think about now that you say, oh, that's kind of an unusual insight about how I think humans connect or how we should behave?
What was the most surprising thing I learned?
Maybe
Basically,
the most surprising, yeah, or something that stands out as being unusual. So the most surprising, yeah.
What surprised me about this research? Um, one thing that was really interesting, we were talking about Norbert Elias, who told this story of progress. He said, in the Middle Ages, we used to act like this, and now Erasmus wrote this book, and now we're better. And what's interesting is he actually didn't have access to a whole body of like literature and etiquette manuals from the Middle Ages. For example, there was this, I mentioned him, alluded to him earlier, this gentleman named Daniel of Beccles, who was kind of the Emily Post of the Middle Ages, and he wrote this 10,000 line poem about every aspect of human life. He had strong thoughts about the proper thing for this and that, and he wrote it for surprisingly egalitarian, like for people of all levels of society. It wasn't just for members of the courts, but for people at all levels of society. I think what's interesting about things like that is like we're always captive to what we unknown unknowns, what we don't know. Like Erasmus made this argument, this sweeping argument about human history when he had limited, incomplete information, and I think that's maybe one takeaway I would make of this book, like just the way in which we never have perfect or complete information about anyone, having that kind of humility to recognize. I think humility is a core thing that I took away after writing this book. Like I read thousands of books related to the subject matter, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface. And I think this is the trajectory of what an undergraduate degree who comes on campus, undergraduate who comes on campus and thinks they know everything, and then they get a master's and they realize they know a little bit less, and they get their PhD and they're like, I really don't know anything about anything at all. And I don't know where you at now. Maybe you've actually figured out everything and you're really all the answers. But yeah, I do think just generally this kind of hidden and forgotten virtue of just humility. I think it's really easy to feel like we know and have all the answers to all the things, and recognize that actually no one does. We're all like just severely incomplete in one area, which is why exercising these muscles of curiosity and humility can be so important.
Yeah, Sean.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity for engagement, Lexi, and for sharing your book with us, with the community. My question is this regarding kind of this, following up on some of the issues that you raised in this very lively conversation, is this question of the past, especially the past when we talk about the concept of civility, our perception in public discourse when we invoke the term civility, especially in reference to sort of the good old days, if you will. Things used to sort of, the adoption of certain decorum, certain practices, certain norms of dialogue, of exchange. Is it often the case that people in public discourse are exercising selective memory in terms of how they're actually constructing that narrative of civility and the narrative of lost civility that may have not existed in the shape or the form that we're describing? For instance, I suspect that in the lead up to you writing this book, there was so much discourse happening around the civility has been, after 2016, civility has been lost in Washington. You have people who heckle members of Congress and senators at restaurants, and that didn't used to happen, and people used to sort of conduct themselves differently. But then I sort of wonder what did things look like beforehand, and I think it's very easy for people to forget that at one point in time, like then Vice President Dick Cheney actually used profanity against another member of, I think, Patrick Leahy at the time, and on the Senate floor, in an exchange. That is to say, is there a danger in the way that we're actually talking about that concept of civility, especially with respect to that historical memory and what it embodies in the past? Is there is there a danger in simplifying the past a little bit and being a little bit too selective or cherry picking in the way that we're constructing that past?
I love that question. Thank you so much. And this is one reason why I do draw so much from history in my book. I think that, yes, cherry picking history is a problem, but also I think that we kind of have no historical grounding for the most part. Like, I think a symptom of that is we hear the phrase unprecedented a lot today. And actually, if you are a student of history, you realize that there's actually very little that is truly unprecedented. As the book of Ecclesiastes says in the Hebrew Bible, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Because human nature doesn't change. And so in my book, I talk about how history is both a caution to us and a comfort. It's a caution because we realize things have actually been really bad in the human historical record, but also in our own country. We fought a revolutionary war, a civil war. Like, we're not living under Jim Crow laws anymore. These are all, we're not, of course, by no means perfect today, but things have been really bad before.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a comfort. It's a caution that they've been bad before they can get bad again, but also a comfort that they've been bad before. They're not maybe quite there. We're not at the brink of a civil war that decimated, over 500,000 people. Like, I also love, being a student of history because it cautions you against this sort of apocalypticism or this fear, that things really have never been so bad. In my chapter on civil society, I kind of offer a correction to some of these civil society declinists today that say, we're so uncivil, we're communities on the brink of collapse. And I go all the way back to Aristotle, who was concerned about the collapse of civil society, civilitas societas, that as he called it. He was worried that communities were getting too big. And if communities got too big, then civil society would fall apart. You could only have a civil society with like less than a few thousand people. Any bigger than that, you couldn't have it. And then I fast forward to a gentleman from North Africa, from Algeria, named Ibn Khaldun. And he was an early scholar of civil society as well. And he was worried about, not like Aristotle, that the size of community being a threat to civil society. He was worried about commerce. This is in the like 11th and 12th century. He was really worried about the way that commerce could undermine what he called abasaya, this kind of fellow feeling that kept us kind of coherent and harmonious as a society. And then fast forward, to a gentleman named Adam Ferguson. Adam Ferguson gave us our phrase, civil society. He wrote, a brief history into the nature of civil society. He was the lesser famous Adam of the Scottish Enlightenment. The most famous Adam was Adam Smith, but this is the other famous Adam. And they were actually friends, but had a falling out over this essay. Just a tiny footnote really quickly. When Adam Ferguson came out with this essay on civil society, Adam Smith cried plagiarism. He thought that Adam Ferguson had plagiarized his work. And Adam Ferguson said, no, you've got it all wrong, Adam Smith. We both cited Montesquieu. We both drank from the same intellectual well. I didn't plagiarize you, but they never recovered that. I call that section of my book, The Uncivil Roots of Civil Society. This is the S that coined this term, civil society, and the cries of plagiarism abound in this little narrative of human history. And then it's really fascinating to go to, fast forward to Tocqueville, who was also Alexis de Tocqueville, a thoughtful observer of civil society. And he thought that civil society was important, but also potentially undermined by egoism, by individualism. He thought that Americans had reduced egoism to an art and a craft and a lifestyle, and that we needed civil society and this buttress of community to keep our individualism in check, and that's what supported a democracy. And then fast forward several decades, a century or so, to a guy named Robert Nisbet. He wrote this fascinating book called The Quest for Community, and his big bad that he thought threatened civil society and civility in life was war. He wrote in the 1950s, and he was really concerned about how total war had crippled sort of the local governance model, the family, and kind of overreached and overintruded into people's lives. And he was really worried about the ramifications of that for community and civil society. Fast forward a few decades later, in the late 90s, a guy named Robert Putnam comes out with a book, an essay, and then a book, called Bowling Alone, where he talks about, how we're just not doing stuff together anymore. We're not bowling in groups, we're bowling alone. And his big bad is television and air conditioning, things that are bringing us away from others and into isolation, into our living rooms, into our homes. And of course, even to this day, we have a new big bad, right? It's social media, it's technology, it's the ubiquity, these things that are drawing us even further inward to ourselves and our own community and separating us from others. And what's really interesting, I think it's interesting to put this whole kind of body of literature and dialogue together, because you see, like, people have been concerned about this problem of threats to community and civility and civil society for a very, very long time. They've isolated certain epiphenomena, and yet we're still here. We're still doing life together. Like, we're doggedly social as a species. And I think this is just a part of who we are. And yes, new technologies, new forces, commerce, growth of society, moving from Gesellschaft to Gemeinschaft, from or Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, from rural community to society, to the way that novel technologies change how we interact. These are going to disrupt, how we interact together. But I don't think anything will ever permanently and irreparably kill this beautiful social impulse that is, what it means to be human. And so I think it's really, essential to keep this history, front of mind, that society is fragile, civilization, democracy is beautiful and precarious and fragile, but it's also resilient because we're resilient as well.
Okay. Yes.
I've loved reading your book. It's really
Thank
fantastic.
you.
I wonder whether you think there are any behaviors or any speech that is in some sense beyond the range of, it is not amenable to a civility solution, if I can put it in that way. In other words, if somebody got up here today and made a vigorous defense of the Holocaust, we wouldn't want to have a civil discussion with that person, I don't think, would we? And if Stalin walked in, we wouldn't say, "Hey, Mr. Stalin, please take a seat.
Right.
I want to talk about stuff with you." Or should we? I mean, and if so, how do we figure out where to put the ropes around?
It's a great question. Thank you for being here. Thank you for that thoughtful inquiry. So this is what I think makes my book slightly different from other books in the pluralism, the heterodox, the pro-free speech space. A lot of books in this space might argue, this all ideas are equal, and in a marketplace of ideas, let's bring all ideas to the fore and let the best ideas, win out. That's kind of a traditional argument. And I'm actually not making the case for that, because I don't think all ideas are equal. And I don't think all ideas, such as ideas about racial hierarchies, certain human groups being superior to others. I don't think those, and other dehumanizing, barbaric, bigoted views of the world, I don't think that those should be given equal space and time to other more worthy ideas. But what I do think is that all people are equal, and that even if someone holds a view that I find morally abhorrent and detest, that even they deserve a bare minimum of respect. That I don't have to respect their ideas and hold it to be equal with other ideas that I think are better, but I do think that all people are, and every one of us owes and is ourselves and owes to others a bare minimum of respect. Yes.
It seems to me that a lot of the issues that we're arguing with each other about are just fundamentally very different from what they were, say, 30, 40 years ago. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe it's just in my own situation in this world, but it seems that a lot of the issues that are just so controversial and disputed today, many of them revolve around identity, personal identity. And there was a book I read a year or two ago about, the human need right now in this particular time and place for, validation of our identities from others. So how would you, we're not really arguing, so possibly about, taxes or maybe some foreign policy or Medicare or, a lot of it is reserved for the identity issues. So how would your principles apply, or would they apply differently when confronted with issues like that? Because if you're, say, disagreeing with somebody about an issue relating to identity, then to that person, what you're doing then is denying their identity, or the issue is not up for debate because it's their identity. And I just see that that group of identity issues just getting wider and wider. So how would your principles apply to those types of interactions and discourses?
It's a great question. And I mean, I almost want to toss this one back to you, Dr. Fukuyama. You wrote a whole book on identity, and he and I talk about this as well in my book. I talk about how there is a core tension in the human condition between wanting to be equal with others, isothumos, and also wanting precedent over them, megalothumos, right? And that this is we want to be equal to others. We also want to be superior to them. And in this chapter of my book on equality, I talk about how this has always been the case. And across history and culture, we've tried to use different status markers, often the tools of politeness and etiquette, to distinguish, our superiority over others, and these as core identity markers. An example from history that I think is very funny. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, and the ancient Macedons, like Philip of Macedon, they were ethnically the same. They were both ethnically Greek, and yet the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, they told themselves stories of superiority over all other people groups, but especially the Macedons. If you didn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. Your language was just sounded like bar. That's where we get our phrase barbarian from. And if you weren't Greek, then you were just not culturally the same. You were culturally and morally, intellectually inferior. They told these stories of difference, and then like a story of superiority as well. So with the Macedons, they told this story of identity and superiority based on manners and based on politeness and trivialities. Like, the ancient Greeks, they cut their wine with salt water. The Macedons drank it straight. We're better than that. Like, the way we do it is better. The ancient Greeks ate reclined, whereas the Macedons ate sitting up. And that was another difference that, Freud called this the narcissism of small differences. The way we find these differences, and we tell ourselves stories of superiority based on these differences. We can't just let, and I think this is a core problem that we've been struggling with as long as we've been around as a species. We can't just let difference be different. Like, you do you eat your food with your hands or chopsticks, I eat it with fork and knife. Like, we can't just let that be different. We have to tell stories of, sort of a moral valence to this difference. And we often want to self-justify. And this is a core argument of my book, why I'm saying, leave the rules of etiquette at the door and instead focus on like the heart, the disposition behind someone's action. Don't judge them based on these superficial things, whether they know which fork to use at the dinner table, but like focus on, as Dr. King might say, the content of their character, and don't let these superficial, trivial things get in the way of community and flourishing and relationship. But I think you're right that these differences obscure the fundamental truth that we have far more in common as members of the human community, as citizens of this great nation, than which differentiates us.
Okay. Yeah, all right.
As you diagnose this period of relative incivility, I'm interested if your intuition is that we're in a sort of a secular pattern or more of a cyclical pattern. I'm guessing maybe you think cyclical because you're talking about healing. And so then my follow-up to that would be, as you look through history, have you seen other cycles of acute incivility? And have you seen any patterns about how societies have corrected those cycles? How do we get out of these cycles if in fact we're in a cycle?
It's a great question. I love this line from Mark Twain. He says, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. You know, it tends to, we have similar themes that do surface time and time again. And I love this one story that surfaced during my research on this topic about, you know, it was not that long ago, a few decades ago in American history that illustrates this pattern that we're talking about of incivility. Apparently, the late 1990s was a historically uncivil time in our country because an unprecedented amount of philanthropic will and political capital converged to do something incredible. The Pew Charitable Trust donated almost $1 million that the Aspen Institute administered in Washington, D.C., to have a series of civility summits for Congress. And almost half of Congress in 1998 went out to Hershey, Pennsylvania to rehumanize our public discourse and to restore civility and these civic bonds of affection that had been really deeply strained by recent political battles and dramas. And the Civility Summit at Hershey was structured like this, that about half the time members were encouraged to bring their families, their husbands or their wives and their children, and they just had unstructured free time. They played, they ate, they just enjoyed each other's company. They saw each other outside of the office context, outside of the debates on the floors of Congress, and saw each other in the fullness of who they were as fathers, mothers, husbands, wives. And then the other half of the time was spent in formal sessions exploring institutional challenges to civility and what they might do to restore functionality to Congress. Like, they were failing their constituents by not being able to work together and pass laws. They're the democratically elected body of Congress. They're not doing what they were supposed to do. And everyone who went to that summit, again, about half of Congress went. Everybody came back, said this was the best thing ever. You know, we've done it. Like, we're gonna do better together. And Tip O'Neill and Newt Gingrich said we have to do this every year. This is just so good for our working relationships. And there was hope in Congress and Washington and our world that maybe we could restore civility and comity and harmony in our public life. And then guess what happened? The Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. And all of a sudden, all bets were off. Once again, this is an opportunity to embarrass the president, impeach the president, and just became scorched earth, total war once again. And what I love, you asked for patterns, you asked for trends that we say, and a trend I see time and time again is that we are socially and doggedly social, and we are resilient. Like we want to, as long as we've been around as a species, we've come together to do this thing called life with others. We know that we're more likely to survive and actualize and become our best selves and flourish in community. And yet, society and community, civilization, democracy, it's all fragile, it's all deeply precarious. And this is, one example of that. A lot of things happened and converged to restore these civic bonds. And they were repaired, they were restored, but they're also fragile. This one opportunity, this one scandal, tore all the shreds all over again. And that there were other attempts in subsequent years and in 2001, to have other civility summits. None of them had the same attendance or kind of will and hope that this original one did. And I learned this story by pouring through dozens of hours of C-SPAN footage. It was a fun kind of research project, and just seeing kind of the categorical hope just kind of dashed. And the reality is that the same dynamics that support a democracy and a free and flourishing society at the citizen level, like friendship, restoring trust and bonds of affection, and making our homes and lives spaces of hospitality, that those same dynamics are what support a democracy among our public leaders too. It's civic friendship at that level and at ours, the level of civilians and citizens. And it's all precarious. It's all fragile. But at the same time, we each have way more power, way more agency to be a part of the solution than we realize. And that's really like the theory of social change that I advocate for throughout the book, that we can't change society. We can't, snap our fingers and control who's president and how our public leaders are interacting, but we can change ourselves. We can be more intentional about knowing our neighbors and inviting people into our homes and lives, and restoring civic trust and affection at the local level that can have way more power to heal our deep divides and our alienated and lonely moment than we realize.
Yes.
Connecting.
Okay.
I'm just wondering to what extent you think that human nature is to be civil and to what extent it is to be uncivil, and therefore to how important is education in ensuring a civil society?
Great question. In the opening chapter of my book, I tell a story that illustrates the timelessness of this problem. Has anyone in this room read the story by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Is anyone familiar with this story? It's a great story that illustrates the duality of this tension, this battle between civilization, barbarism, civility and incivility in our lives and our souls. The story is that Dr. Jekyll is this illustrious, prestigious, universally adored local leader and physician in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Yet he struggles with these baser urges, these impulses that he can't quite seem to control. And so he creates this potion that he drinks at night, and it transforms him into this monstrous, evil, barbaric, inhuman, animalistic Mr. Hyde, who goes out and murders people, robs people, that wreaks havoc on society at night. And so Dr. Jekyll thinks he's found a solution. He's able to, get those urges out of his system by night and keep his prestigious, pristine reputation intact by day. But then something quite extraordinary happens. Dr. Jekyll realizes that the more often that he drinks this potion, the more voluntarily, the more easily he becomes Mr. Hyde. And eventually he's able to transform into Mr. Hyde without the potion at all. He just transforms into Mr. Hyde spontaneously. And eventually he permanently becomes Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde permanently kills Dr. Jekyll. And in his note that Dr. Jekyll leaves, he says, to answer your question, Brian, it cannot be said that I was either purely Jekyll or purely Hyde, that I was irrevocably both and. And I think this is such a he's like, I was both friend and fiend. I think that's such a powerful illustration of this duality that I talk about throughout the book, this duality in our nature, love of others and love of self. And St. Augustine, really famous philosopher, he talked about how an extension of this love of self, what he called the incurvatus in se, the inward curve upon the self that defines all of us, is an indelible part of the human condition, human personality that we all share, is what he called the libido dominandi, which is the lust to dominate. And this is an interesting wordplay in the original Latin that he wrote this in, that the lust to dominate is a part of all of our souls and a part of all of us. But the more that we exercise the lust to dominate, the more that Dr. Jekyll drank the potion and gave life and animated those baser desires and impulses, they become the dominating lust. Like that Mr. Hyde took over, ultimately, permanently, Dr. Jekyll. And I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to education for this reason. Dr. Augustine talks about how this libido dominandi is a symptom and a part of disordered loves. And he's a big fan of the liberal arts and the humanities and exposing us to beauty and goodness and truth to cultivate our humanity, to order our passions, help us, spontaneously consider the needs and well-being of others alongside of ourselves. That's actually not innate. You don't have to teach a child to be selfish. You have to teach them to share and consider others alongside of ourselves. And that this is the project of education. That the project of education is creating good humans and cultivating our humanity, bringing forth that which is most noble and best in us, and diminishing that which is ignoble, and that which is bringing forth our Dr. Jekyll and diminishing our Mr. Hyde in every single one of us. So I talk about this kind of forgotten notion of education as soulcraft, of ordering our passions, of cultivating our humanity, and not just making us more human, but also more gentle and humane as well. Because the more that we appreciate the gift of being human in ourselves, the more that we appreciate it in others too. And I do think that's a core issue that we're facing in our world today. We insufficiently appreciate the gift of being human, both in ourselves and in others. And my book that's why I refer to my book often as like a humanistic manifesto, extolling the gift of being human, the beauty and dignity that every single one of us as human beings have. Because as we do appreciate that in ourselves, we do appreciate that in others, even and especially those that we don't like, who hold ideas we find abhorrent, those that we disagree with, which is what I think we need now more than ever.
Okay, well, I've always had this theory that if you really wanted to deal with polarization in Congress, that what you needed to do is take an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, drop them in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and like the Army does with Ranger training, say, okay, make your way back to Las Vegas. And by the time they got back, they would learn to work with each other. So
I love that idea.
yeah.
Maybe we should do it.
Yeah, we should do it. Okay, Alexandra, thank you very much for this. This has been a terrific presentation and good discussion, and good luck with the rest of your book tour. And thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for hosting this conversation. To all of you for being here. Really, really honored to have you.
Okay. Thank you.